Hi, welcome back to your virtual learning space. This is video 8. As always, we try to remove distractions and just be in a place to accept information and think about new ideas. If you learned something interesting, please go teach somebody immediately. I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing it, but I hope I've drilled it in. So, on my map, we are on the green sections. So we're talking about the fruit trees and the berries, basically, at this first part. And then after the break, we'll go on to zone 4 and 5. So we're talking about the seasonally visited areas, like I said. This is our fruit and nut orchards. This is where we have our fodder for domestic animals, and mushroom cultivation tends to happen in this area as well. In my zone 3, I have espalier fruit trees, which are these guys right here. And I'm just about to talk about espalier, so don't worry if you don't understand the word. And berry bushes. The only one that's properly developed on my property at the moment is this gooseberry bush, or this blackcurrant bush. But I do have baby gooseberry, blackberry, and raspberry bushes, which I plan to plant in the front of my property. So what is an espalier? Espalier are trained fruit trees. Now, mine are quite messy compared to this beautiful image which I found on the internet. So what we're doing here is that we're training a fruit tree to be against the wall. So we're pulling it back, and we're, instead of allowing it to grow as a big crown, we're actually telling it, no, we want you to grow right here. Okay? So one of the main reasons to do this is that it's very space efficient. Obviously, if a tree has a big crown, it's taking up a lot of space. But if we can pin it against the wall, we can open up more space underneath it than we would be able to if we didn't. So the reason that I espaliered the fruit trees on this property, on my parents' property, is because we don't have the room to put in. I have an apple, a pear, and a plum. But we wouldn't have the space to put those in and still have grass and still have the open space for a veggie garden. You know, these things would be much bigger. So by tying them back and pulling them back against the wall, I've made it so that we can have those fruit trees and have the benefit of them without them taking up as much space as they would like to. This is a little bit of forcing them to do something they're not normally naturally going to do. A great reason for doing it as well is easy harvest. So you can see this lady here is obviously finding it very easy to harvest her pears. Just walking along with a little basket. It can be quite difficult to harvest from a full crown tree, but by espaliering against the wall, we remove that difficulty. It's also great for using thermal mass. So in zone 0, we talked about thermal mass. And a lot of fruit requires extra heat to mature and to ripen. By using the thermal mass of a wall, we can give extra warmth, extra heat to the tree and help it to ripen more quickly, and hence we get more valuable fruit. Everyone's been in a position where the fruit isn't completely ripe, or tomatoes, for example, in our climate, can be in a position where they just stay green right to the end of the season because they don't get enough heat. A great book on this is The Edible Forest Garden by Dave Jacques. It's actually a 2-volume book, but it is invaluable for talking about trees as trees and other plants as a food source. So like these are much more dependable food sources than things like annual grains. Like if you think about the difference between planting an oak tree for your flour, because you can make flour from acorns, versus every year you have to plant your wheat, right? You plant the oak tree once, and about 4 or 5 years into its growth, it starts just dropping acorns round the clock for the next 500 years. That's it. Like you've done it. Does that make sense? Cool. Right. So Forests 101. I just want to talk about forests because this is the area of this is what our zone 3 could be. You could put in a food forest in a zone 3, right? We start off by talking about trees from an outside perspective. So trees are rainmakers. They are constantly condensing and evaporating. They're constantly feeding the climate water. So if you've got a warm, uh, let's say, if your breeze is warmer and more humid than the tree will condense water out of the air. And it'll take it into its stem, into its trunk, and it'll drip down through it, but it'll also drip into the soil around it, like rain. Okay? But also, they're constantly evaporating. They're constantly feeding water into the climate, into the atmosphere, which is, I mean, it's completely invaluable. You could not value it more highly. And the reason that a lot of places these days are having problems with drought, like Ireland, is that we don't have enough trees. The trees are water pumps. They are constantly pumping water out of the soil and up into their limbs, up into their leaves, because it's part of photosynthesis. It's called transpiration. All plants grow out of thin air. So every plant we see, every single plant we see is made out of air. It may not look like it, and we may not understand it in that way, but it is completely true. It is made of carbon and nitrogen. These things are harvested from the air by either by the soil or by the plant itself, and materialized, for want of a better word, right? They turn air into these massive green things. Now, I'm not a botanist, like by any stretch of the imagination. I am not a plant expert. But what we can do is we can break a forest into layers. And every forest exists with these layers. There's like a breakdown that we can understand. And even if we don't know what plant goes in the layer for our climate, we can still understand the niche that's there. So there's a place for, or there is a tree for every place in that respect, right? So starting from the very top, we've got the climax and the overstory. Now these are the trees that fundamentally take the longest to get up there, but provide a massive amount of nutrient for everything below it, right? Things like oak trees are a great example of this in our climate. Then underneath that, we've got the understory. Now the understory tends to be where our fruit trees live. Fruit and nuts tend to be in this area. And trees that go in the understory are actually looking for a little bit of shade. They're looking to be in that position. They want the bigger tree to be kind of shading them out just a little bit. And because this is another like niche, there is 1,000 trees that go in this box, right? Number 3 is shrubs. So shrubs are classified as like small woody plants. We are talking about like bushes and things like that, but they always have woody stems. They may not have a trunk, like one woody stem, but they may have many woody stems. Things like berry bushes, coffee. Coffee is a great example of a shrub in this bracket. Yeah. Then we've got the herbaceous layer, which is like bottom right. It's like teeny tiny in the diagram there. And the herbaceous layer are non-woody plants. And the amount of these is absolutely mind-boggling. Like there's no point in going into it without having an hour's lecture on just herbaceous plants, especially in our climate. The best way to describe them is the middling. So like they're not quite like a bush, but they're not quite like a ground cover. They're not like a small thing. They're like small bushes, but they don't have woody stems. They're herbaceous. Then we have the ground covers, which are the teeny tinies. This is plants that like to spread like that. Like they like to spread over the surface of the soil, protecting our soil, but also they don't tend to have the strength is the wrong kind of word, but I think you'll understand what I mean. They don't stand up. They spread out and they cover areas and they grow by spreading, not by growing upwards. Then we've got the root yield. So this is anything that you get a tuber out of. A great example of this is sweet potato. Sweet potato actually stands as a ground cover and a root yield because sweet potatoes like to spread, but they also provide us with a root yield. Other things are like carrots, turnips, parsnips. All these things grow a tuber underground where they store their starch. And the last layer that I'm going to talk about, there we could talk about 5 or 6 different other layers that happen in different climates, but this is like a broad pattern that we're just talking about. So this last one is climbers. And these are plants which want to climb up things. So last week when we were talking about vertical layers, we talked about things like peas and beans. We talked about cucumbers, those things that like to climb up a surface. So they don't have a strong stem, but they do want to get up to the light. And what they do is they tend to like swing around like a little lasso and grab on. And then as they climb, they get more and more light. So that was a lot of information. Did everyone kind of understand what I was getting at? Yeah. And this is a pattern that we can apply across all forests. Amanda, you had a question?
How long have you been studying all this?
I've been at this for about 8 years. I've only been practicing for about 5, but yeah, about 8 years I've been studying.
And how did you get into it?
Originally, actually, it was while I was studying architecture. I was annoyed at the fact that buildings weren't more reactive. And when I looked into more living buildings and living structures, um, permaculture came across my table. And the second I saw it, I was like, that, that's the thing. That's the thing right there. And I've been loving it ever since. Cool. So moving on, chicken tractors. Now, has anyone ever heard of a chicken tractor? Nope. Good. So here we have 2 examples of a chicken tractor. Now, the best way to describe a chicken tractor is a mobile habitat for our chickens. Now, it doesn't have to be just chickens. There's many, many animals that could live in a mobile environment. But the reason that we normally use chickens is because of their activities, right? Chickens love to scratch and they also love to manure. Now, that's fine if you've got a space in your property for smelly, scratchy stuff going on. Because the more you leave them in one place, the more their nutrient will build up, the more that they will take over a space. But using a chicken tractor, we can move them from place to place, right? So the scratching that they do is a job that they love. This is one of the outputs that we can really put to use. While they're scratching, they're actually breaking weed cycles and pest cycles. So they're eating all the little larvae for the pests, like fruit flies, for example. And they're also eating all the seeds for weeds. So by putting them into a place, we get them to prepare the soil for us to use in such a way that it is ready for cultivation, right? It doesn't matter if we're planting a forest or our veggie garden. There is unlimited uses for this particular system, as well as the fact that it makes the chickens happy. As we move the chickens around, they get a new habitat. And they're like, oh, new spot to be grabbing on. Get in there. They're like really excited. Whenever you move a chicken tractor, it's fantastic to watch them because they are genuinely like, oh, a new place. What are we going to do here? The reason that I have two up is because I just wanted to give an idea that it's a scaled thing again, right? So the one in the bottom left, which is very, very pretty, would be for maybe three chickens, three or four chickens. And we'd be moving that maybe every day or two because they've been manure the area that they're in and they'd be finished with an area quite quickly. And the one on the right, we could probably move it a little bit less frequently, but there could be up to 30 chickens in something that size, which is like, it's a lot of chickens. It's a lot to be taken care of. Another job that they love to do is manuring and shredding mulch. So we can throw in our straw or bark mulch into this area. And what they'll do is they'll shred it up, make it a little bit smaller and a little bit more accessible for our soil to use as food. But they also manure it, which again is adding nutrient. So the job that they do, the job that chickens do, is best is put to its best effect when we move them a lot, because they as a species love to move around. If you've ever had chickens, you will know that the second the door is open, they're gone. They're out there and they're in your veggies. They're like, ooh, new place, what's here? Ooh. They're kind of like goats in that way. Goats are another one that I don't know, could you really tractor them in the same way? But you could certainly have a system where you're moving goats around your property. Um, because goats can be incredibly destructive, but they can also be massively helpful if we're moving them fast enough. Right? Everyone's got that? Oh, Dave, you have a question.
Um, the chicken tractor is a really cool idea that I didn't know existed, but you mentioned at the start that it's possible to do it with like other animals.
Mm-hmm.
Goats you just mentioned now, but that's not so feasible for me personally, or I think a lot of people around Cork. Would there be any other small animals that would be suitable for that kind of thing?
Well, any animal that lives on like our soil is possible to put into this system. Rabbits would be another one that would be quite good on our, like you say, on our scale. But rabbits don't tend to have a lot of outputs that we can use apart from their manure unless you like eating rabbit. Now, don't get me wrong, rabbits are very tasty. I don't know, should I be saying that? But at the same time, unless you're producing, unless the output matches the input, so like you do have to move this. There is work involved in this system. But if you were keeping pet rabbits, if that was something that you wanted to keep, this would certainly be a good way to move them around, so that they didn't overgraze one particular area. Ducks are another great one in this particular instance. Ducks work well in a tractor system. The reason that I highlighted chickens is because it is best suited to chickens for our purposes. Cool. So moving right on from that, we're going to talk about silvopasture. Has anyone heard this word before? No. Good. Once again. Right. So here we have some cows and some goats. And they look like they're in a natural environment, like in their natural home environment. But actually what we've done here is we've taken their pasture land and introduced trees. Now, that's got two really, really good um, positive outcomes for our system, right? Number one, mast, which is fodder for the plants, for the animals, falls from the trees, right? So we can plant trees that give our animals extra food. So like for example, cows can actually process, I think they say 47 different plants, but we only feed them grass or grain. We really restrict their diet by doing that. But if we were to put them into a system with, for example, honey locust, that is a bean pod that falls and is much more nutritious, and they love it. Another one is bamboo. Cows love bamboo. They will strip all the leaves off your bamboo overnight and process your bamboo for you if you're going to be using it for a building material, right? So if we were to look at different pasture systems for animals, we could put in black locust, which is a type of tree, for chickens. This again has a really nutritious seed pod, which chickens love to eat. But also, black locust goes on to be a very useful building material. It's actually one of the most rot resistant woods on the planet. You can, like, most woods, you have to treat them to put them outdoors. Black locust, you don't. It will just last outdoors. Like I said, honey locust is really good for cattle. Um, pigs pigs are an interesting creature to live with. I don't know if anyone's ever lived with pigs, but I've lived on a couple of pig farms. They are super quick for starters and unbelievably smart. So if we put into place oaks and pears in their environment, as well as whatever we're normally feeding them, pigs will they will jump over stuff to get at some acorns. They love them, and the same with any soft fruits. They love to munch down some sweet stuff. But pears specifically, for some reason, are like the best candy for pigs. So again, what we're talking about is incorporating food from trees for our animals. We don't have to be just growing grass for these animals to live for our animals to live on, right? But there's another side that we haven't really talked about, and that's the soil. So on pasture systems, the soil actually gets drained. It gets used up because we're growing something that we grow it up and then we munch it down. And then we grow it up and we munch it down. And there's very little feeding going on there. So then as all best intentioned farmers do, we come in with a fertilizer, whether it be organic or synthetic, but that's not feeding the soil in the same way that a tree can. So trees are mineral miners. They have associations with fungi in the soil. The fungi harvest minerals, like trace elements, from way down in the soil and exchange them at the root level with trees. Trees give fungi sugars in return for minerals. And what the trees do with those minerals is they put them into their leaves and they put them into their fruit. So by doing this, we're cycling the minerals from down deep in the soil, bringing them up to the tree level and letting them fall on top of the soil. And if you remember from last week, we're talking about building soil. So we're talking about stacking nutrition on top of the soil so that the soil can eat it, right? The idea of green mulch and green compost is just that stuff falls from the tree and it covers the soil. Again, providing that like sunscreen slash moisturizer like I talked about last week. And also through fall. So that's where rain falls on the tree and filters down very slowly until you get to about an inch and a half. And then after an inch and a half of rain, it just starts falling straight through. But for that first inch and a half, the water that falls is cleaning the tree. So all the little bits and pieces that are on it, all the little bits of manure, the little bits of dead insects and insect wings and all the goodies for the soil get washed off the tree down to the soil. I call it like tree bath water, in the same way that we were talking about grey water last week being very nutritious for the plants. Is that all making sense? Sweet. So, right, this is a word which for the first year or two that I was studying permaculture, I did not understand what this word meant. So what is a swale? Now, in the simplest, most mechanical terms that I can put on it, a swale is a water harvesting contoured ditch. Okay? So this is a cross section of a swale. This is actually by Midwest Permaculture, which is my alma mater. This is where I went to learn permaculture. And this cross section just gives us an idea of what we're talking about. Now, because this is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object, I need to put into place that it is on contour. So we know the contours on a map, right? So like all the points on a contour match up with the same elevation. So it forms like an unusual shape. It's not about like straight lines. It's normally quite unique to every different hill, right? If we follow the contour in the same way that we would follow a straight line with a swale, what we do is we create a level field in the middle of that swale where water can collect, sit, and then soak, right? One of the main things we want to talk about with swales is their water harvesting systems. So instead of a straight slope where water falls, and if our soil isn't ready for the water to fall, it'll just sheet off the surface. It'll fly away, it'll go downhill to wherever it's going to get caught. If we put in place this system, what we've done is we've basically set up a catcher's mitt for water. And the water hits the edge of the swale, hits the edge of the berm in the diagram here. It hits it, and then it stops. It sits, it might collect to a certain level. When the rain stops, it slowly sinks into the soil. So what we're doing here is we're recharging the groundwater. Rather than just letting that water run away, we are stopping it, spreading it, and soaking it into our soil. So water travels incredibly slowly through soil, like incredibly, incredibly slowly. But that also means that sometimes soil can't absorb water that's moving quickly. So again, we need to stop that. We need to stop it where it falls so that we can allow the soil to soak it up. It's the I don't know if I made this analogy before, but it's the same as a dry sponge versus a wet sponge. So if you take a dry sponge and you put it under a tap that's going like full belt, all the water runs off it. Like you get very little infiltration into a dry sponge. But if you take that same sponge and you wet it in some water first so that it's like damp, and you turn on that same water flow, it just disappears. It like flows into it. It doesn't flow off it. It doesn't flow off the surface. It flows into it. And eventually we get to the point where it's saturated and it's coming out the bottom. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about slowing down the water so that it can infiltrate into our soil. There are obviously scales of swale, right? So they start very small. We call them micro swales when we use them in like a suburban property. It's the same principle, but it's just teeny, right? The most common swale that gets put in most properties would be a wheelbarrow sized swale. Because this whole path, the swale is just a path, if this path is all level and we can be harvesting from our trees, we can be walking along with a wheelbarrow for miles and it doesn't feel heavy because we're moving on a flat plane. So wheelbarrow sized swales right up to, I've seen swales that you could pass 2 cars in. Like they get really, really, really big. But like I said, wheelbarrow swales are the most normal size that I see. But for our purposes here, I could put micro swales in my property to help the water to infiltrate because, like I've said, our soil is very clay heavy, so the water runs off the top of it super quick. One thing to definitely understand is that swales are tree growing systems. They really like to grow trees. It's a very important part of the way they operate. They like to root down into it and they will have access to water their whole life. It takes up to 20 years for us to see the water that falls on a swale again. Like it just goes into the soil and it slowly, slowly, slowly infiltrates. And because it's moving so slowly, the plants have the ability to catch it. It doesn't run right past their roots before they can get a handle on it. Right. mushroom cultivation. So mushrooms are amazing. There's probably the best text in the world on mushrooms is written by Paul Stamets. Paul Stamets is an alien. The guy is unbelievably smart. He has been studying fungus for basically his whole adult life, and he knows more than any other human being on the planet. He is a phenomenon. The man is made of mushrooms. There's no two ways about it. And his book, Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms, is a must read. You can go to fungi.com where you can get all the information, and you can also get all the bits and pieces that you need to make a system where you're growing mushrooms. One thing we've got to highlight straight off the bat is that mushrooms are not a plant and they're not an animal. They're closer to an animal than they are to a plant, but they are neither. They are their own kingdom. So here we have a mushroom log, right? And what the person who made this has done is they've taken a log that they've cut out of a tree, and you drill holes into it, and then you put in a plug that's been inoculated with mycelium. So you're basically putting in a seed for mushrooms. And what the mushrooms do with that is they send out their mycelium, which are like the little white roots that you see on the floor of the forest. They send all those mycelium out and they eat that whole log. And the mushrooms that we understand are actually just a fruiting body and are very short-lived and delicate. They're not designed to last for more than a day. Some of them don't even last a couple of hours. We need to get out early to catch them, number one. And number two, they're not designed to last. They're supposed to be ingested. They're supposed to be used very quickly because they're full of spores, which is the way that mushrooms spread their seed. That's how mushrooms spread in a normal environment. Now, one mushroom log is great, but we can actually make systems where we have multiple mushroom logs. This is a picture from a friend's property in Connecticut, and he grows mushrooms as his job. The dude he's not as knowledgeable as Paul Stamets, but he is very knowledgeable about mushrooms. And he has a system whereby he is constantly cycling mushrooms. He is constantly growing new crops of mushrooms, and he sells them at farmers markets. Amanda, you had a question?
I was just going to say I'm just getting a cup of tea, but I'm listening to you. You
Okay.
just won't see me here for a second.
No problem at all. So another system we can use to grow mushrooms it's roughly called a mushroom bucket. But realistically, what we have here is that bucket is full of straw, which has been pasteurized. So we basically strip all evidence of life from the straw. We don't want any spores, we don't want any eggs, we don't want any seeds. Nothing but straw goes into this bucket. And then what we do is we inoculate that with spores. And in this case, the person has used oyster mushrooms. And I am not joking, it takes no time at all for mushrooms to start sprouting out of this system. And again, this is a reusable thing. So you make one mushroom bucket and you keep putting new straw and new inoculum in there, and it just keeps on going. It keeps producing food for you. If anybody who didn't know, but we'll just chat about it really quickly. Mushrooms are super nutritious. They provide nutrition in a way that most animal products and plant products don't. They harvest different types of nutrition for us. They tend to be high in sterols and lipids, which are things that are not present in such high quantities in plant and animal systems, right? They also support our immune system. And the best example of this is penicillin. Penicillin was the first antibiotic. It is literally putting fungus into your body. Penicillin is a fungus that grows on it's a mold, but it grows on the outside of an orange skin. And it is vicious. It kills any microbes that are not part of you. It just wipes through them. And it does it because that's its natural behavior. It's defending itself. And by putting it into us, it's defending us from a pathogen. The last thing to talk about mushrooms is that they're the teeth of the soil. So the soil is constantly trying to grow. And it can't grow without eating, obviously. And the mushrooms, the mycelium more specifically, form the teeth. They are the eating part of the soil. A forest grows on a fallen forest. So like anyone who's walked through a forest, picked up a branch from the ground, and it's been eaten by some fungus, it like snaps right open. It's been eaten at a molecular level. It's not even like you could see teeth marks in it. It's been eaten by tiny things, right? Mycelium are only one cell thick. So they grow by spreading. They don't grow bigger. They grow by moving out like that, right? Does anyone have questions about mushrooms? Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you got a ton of value out of this video. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can stay up to date with my most recent material. Have a great day.